In this Final Fantasy 16 video, we're going to talk about the best skills you should go for early, but also some of the endgame options that are actually super strong. After finishing the game and pretty much everything it has to offer, there are a few outliers here that are just amazing, either at pure damage, but many of them at boss stagger too. And generally speaking, you'll actually want a combination of both damage and stagger, since that's going to further amplify your damage even more, especially against tougher enemies. Now, quick explanation about the skill trees, or should I say circles. There are 7 of them in total that you'll eventually unlock. The first one in the middle is your main one, the primary, which deals basically with your melee attacks, and there's also a few utility skills in here too. Then you will start unlocking the ones for the Eikons as you progress through the main story, beginning with Ifrit, then Geruda, and so on, until you get all these cool ones right here, each with their own specific abilities, but also very cool unique passive mechanics. We'll talk about those in just a bit, but in the meantime, there are a couple, I would say, must-have unlocks right in the middle circle. The first one is Swift Recovery, which lets you basically immediately recover after being knocked back by an enemy attack. This can actually be quite annoying. You really don't want to waste any time doing that, so if you press R1 or whatever your dodge button is, this immediately brings Clive back on its feet so you can resume attacking. Another one is the lunge attack, and that actually works really great as a gap closer on top of whatever gap closer you already have from the Eikon powers. Like for example, the Phoenix shift early on, which already kind of brings you close to enemies. Well, this is on top of that, and you can totally use it with any other Eikon power, even with the ones that don't actually have a gap closer. Like for example, if you go with something like Odin power, or maybe if you go with like Behemoth power, it's going to work with these as well. Now, in terms of the actual Eikon powers, there are a few for each of them that I found super strong, and I'm also using them in the end game. For Ifrit's power, Flames of Rebirth are probably the best. This isn't so much so for single boss damage, though the damage as well as the stagger is pretty decent, but more so against large groups of enemies. When there's a lot of them, you can just pop this up and it completely deletes everything. Plus, the range on it is absolutely insane. Most important, you will use this to build that limit break gauge, which does so almost instantly, so you can then just use the burn phase against bosses and whatnot. Another really great here is the Scarlet Cyclone, which has the advantage of unlocking super early as soon as you get the powers, and this kinda like just sucks enemies in and also has some good built-in stagger. This is actually part of an endgame rotation that's really great at staggering bosses, so you will totally use this if you go with Ifrit's power. For Geruda's powers, I will not lie, this eventually fell off really bad for me towards the middle of the game and eventually even unspec'd some of these abilities, but I did make use of the aerial blast early on, which is kind of like this tornado that sucks a lot of enemies in. Really great at CC against large groups of enemies until you get some of the other powers. And even though it does say it has the biggest stagger against bosses, usually it wasn't that useful, specifically because they just move through it like it's not even there and the damage is minimal. Its unique class mechanic is the pull that you can do, so you can totally use this while in air and pull off some nice combos, but for the most part they weren't like the highest damage of the bunch. Now, around level 20 or so, you should unlock Ramuh's powers, which is the power of lightning. Again, this is something that eventually I kinda unspec'd out of because of some of the long cast or the short range animations on these. But there are a couple of abilities here that I found really awesome. One was the Thunderstorm. Once I unlocked it, this was a really good damage and oftentimes staggered despite the fact that it only has 2 stars for that. And that's because the majority of enemies you fight when you unlock this kind of have a weakness towards lightning damage, so it helps with that. Otherwise, Judgmental Bolt will eventually be your best ability with this build, though it does cost a lot of those points, or those ability points, so you kinda can use it, but eventually you will want to switch to something else. The Eikon mechanic here was the Blind Justice. It lets you shoot these balls of lightning that will attach to targets. It is kind of a slow cast to do all 6 of them, but once you attach them and hit that target, it can make them like chain this lightning between them and deal some AoE damage. Now, once you reach around the middle of the game, maybe even earlier than that, this is when you will unlock the Titan Eikon or the powers of the Titan Eikon. And actually, these have some really interesting skills over here that can be helpful right out of the gate. Specifically, the main class mechanic called Titanic Block is absolutely amazing since it's the only block actually that exists in game. This literally lets you block any incoming damage, no matter how big or small it is. It can literally block like super mega big attacks coming from boss enemies. Even more so, if you time it correctly and do a perfect block, you can then follow up with a quick counter, which is really excellent at staggering enemies. Oftentimes, enemies tend to overwhelm you with attacks. This actually helps a ton to perfectly counter and then follow up with some really strong attacks to stagger them much faster. And then you can do a quick upheaval, which is again a great stun ability. You can even charge this if you want to or unleash it outright, but this remains one of the best and most solid choices for stunning bosses way into the late game, and actually something that will be part of that rotation. Now, this is where it kind of becomes a bit more interesting, because once you reach that middle part of the game, this is when you unlock the remaining powers, and I do want to touch on these a little bit since eventually you do have to add them to your rotation, and I do want to talk about the ones that I found to be the best. Now, eventually you will unlock Bahamut's power, which is actually extremely powerful. The most powerful ability in game in terms of damage is going to be the Giga Flare, which is this one right here. It's going to cost quite a lot of ability points, but it's going to be super worth it. That's why you will want to maybe sacrifice some of the previous ones for the points and go into this. This is essentially something that you will want to exclusively use as soon as you completely stagger or break an enemy's will bar. In this case, against bosses, you can unleash massive amounts of damage, both from the Giga Flare, but also from the fact that they get increased damage when they are in that stunned phase. Tons of the endgame encounters have tons of HP, so this is going to help you a ton to deal with that and help you a little bit. Outside of that, there is a class mechanic over here which is pretty interesting. Those are the Wings of Light, which essentially lets you kind of like levitate, enter this levitate state. And it can be really nice because you can avoid some of the ground attacks with it, but if you stay long enough, you can also unleash a very powerful kind of like flare of attacks that drop from the sky. You just have to stay in that state for a pretty long duration, so that might not always be viable. The next one is even bigger than this, and probably the best ability in the whole game coming from Shiva's powers. Specifically, the one called Diamond Dust. This again has by far the best stagger in the whole game. As you can see, by default, 5 out of 5 stars. What makes this so great is that there are very few enemies that have cold resistance built in, so this means literally every single time you pull this off, as long as enemies or bosses are in range, you will always destroy their stagger bars. You will just do one cast at max and half of it is already gone, if not even more, depending on the level. Between this, the Scarlet Cycle, and Upheaval, you will eventually stun enemies in this entire rotation and pull off hundreds of thousands of damage towards the end game. Now, the last tree that you unlock is going to be Odin's power, and this actually comes in with some unique mechanics. Dancing Steel is going to be your go-to ability eventually here, since this is going to help you build very fast that Arm of Darkness Icon class ability that you have right here. You can also just do it regularly as you attack enemies with this activated, but this is going to be by far the fastest method, since it just jumps all over the place to all enemies. Now, the Arm of Darkness is actually pretty interesting because if you press circle with this, it lets you change your normal sword to this different one, which also fills a gauge onto the left side as you attack more and more enemies. Once you reach the max level, which is 3 or 5 if you fully upgrade this, you can then unleash that pent-up power by holding the square button and execute the Arm of Darkness. And if you go to level 5 with this, this is going to unleash a massive amount of damage, which is essentially what's going to delete endgame bosses. Once you stagger them and build all of that up, once you have the Arm of Darkness activated, you can just use this against the staggered boss and it should go down super quickly. You can actually activate this prior to using a limit breaker and then use the limit breaker and kind of take advantage of both the Arm of Darkness as well as the heal that you get from Ifrit's power. So you kind of combine both of these powers at the same time. Now, obviously, you don't have to follow my same setup. You can just go with everything else, and eventually you will actually try out some of the other skills too, since you're going to progressively run through these and not immediately have access to all of them. So this is going to be a process that you will constantly unspec from. You will subtract the points you invested in certain abilities and maybe put them into a new one that you just got. I'm going to follow soon with other tips and tricks as well as guides, including one to farm a ton of ability points very fast. So if you want to see any of that, let me know in the comments down below. Also leave a like on this video if you enjoyed it and subscribe for more, and I'll see you guys in the next video.